Have you ever felt so disrespected, so utterly dismissed that you were pushed to a breaking point? For Dr. Althea Hayes, a world-renowned aerospace engineer, that moment came at 35,000 feet. Her simple request for a glass of water was met with inexplicable contempt from a flight attendant named Susan Miller. But this wasn't just poor customer service. This single act of prejudice would unleash a storm of events that not only grounded a 200-passenger jet, but exposed a terrifying secret hiding in plain sight. This is the incredible real-life story of how one woman's quiet dignity in the face of bigotry led to the firing of an entire crew and a discovery that saved countless lives. The air in the cabin of Aura Airlines. Flight 1781 was thick with the manufactured scent of calm, a citrus-infused disinfectant misted over the low, anxious hum of a Tuesday morning. The flight scheduled for a non-stop journey from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International ATL to San Francisco International SFO was a river of humanity flowing into a metal tube. Businessmen loosened their ties before they even sat down, families wrangled, toddlers already sticky with juice, and students with oversized headphones were already lost to the world. Seated in 12C, an aisle seat in the Comfort Plus section, was Dr. Althea Hayes. To the casual observer, she was just another passenger. A black woman in her late 40s, dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue blazer, her hair in immaculate micro-braids pulled back into a sophisticated bun. Her laptop bag resting under the seat in front of her was a well-worn leather satchel from Toomey, its scuffs and marks telling stories of a dozen international airports. Inside it, however, were schematics and safety audit reports that could ground entire fleets. Dr. Hayes wasn't just a passenger. She was the Senior Safety and Propulsion Systems Auditor for Stellara Aerospace, the very company that had manufactured this gleaming new Boeing 737 MAX 9. She was flying to SFO to oversee the final phase of a crucial software patch integration for another major carrier. Flying for her wasn't just a means of transport, it was her life's work. She felt a familiar pang of professional pride as the boarding process continued with practiced efficiency. She knew the tensile strength of the fuselage, the precise tolerance of the wing bolts, the redundant systems built into the avionics. She saw the plane not as a single object, but as a symphony of millions of meticulously designed parts working in concert. The lead flight attendant for the main cabin, Susan Miller, stood near the galley, a strained smile plastered on her face. At 52, Susan had been flying for nearly 30 years. Her once bright Aura Airlines uniform seemed to hang a little looser on her weary frame. The smile didn't reach her eyes, which darted around the cabin, cataloguing passengers not as people, but as potential problems. A crying baby in row 21, a group of rowdy college kids in the back, a man with an oversized carry-on trying to jam it into the overhead bin. Susan felt a familiar resentment bubble in her chest. She had been passed over for the purser position, again in favor of a 28-year-old named Jessica, who knew more about Instagram than emergency procedures. The company was pushing older, more experienced attendants like her onto less desirable domestic routes, her seniority checkmated by a corporate obsession with youth and brand image. Every beep of a boarding pass scanner felt like a tick of a clock counting down her relevance. Today her mortgage payment was late, her son had called asking for money again, and the traffic to the airport had been a nightmare. Susan was a powder keg of personal grievances, looking for a place to vent the pressure. As Althea settled into her seat, she felt the telltale dryness in her throat that always came with recycled cabin air. She rarely drank coffee or soda on flights, preferring to stay hydrated with simple plain water. The boarding process was nearly complete, and the flight attendants were beginning their final cabin check before closing the main door. She saw Susan Miller moving down the aisle, her movements sharp and impatient. When Susan reached her row, Althea caught her eye and offered a polite, warm smile. "Excuse me," Althea said, her voice calm and clear. "When you have a moment, could I please have a bottle of water?" Susan stopped. Her eyes scanned Althea from head to toe. The tailored blazer, the expensive bag, the confident posture. Something in her expression tightened a flicker of an ugly preconceived notion. She saw a black woman in a premium seat, and an assumption, toxic and baseless, formed in her mind. "We'll begin our beverage service once we reach cruising altitude," Susan said, her voice clipped and devoid of any warmth. She didn't say, "Ma'am" or "Miss." She didn't return the smile. "I understand," Althea replied, still polite. "I just have a bit of a dry throat. I'd be grateful for it whenever you get a chance before takeoff." Susan gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and moved on her face a mask of irritated duty. Althea watched her go, a small, uneasy feeling beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. It was a feeling she knew well, the subtle shift in atmosphere, the cold edge in a voice, the dismissal that was about more than just a request. She had hoped, as she always did, that she was mistaken. But in her gut, she knew the symphony of the flight was about to hit a dangerously discordant note. The cabin door was sealed with a heavy, satisfying thud. The jet bridge retracted, and the world outside Althea's small oval window began to slide away. The safety demonstration video played on the seatback screens, a cheerful, cartoonish affair that belied the serious physics of flight. Althea watched it with a professional eye, noting the clarity of the instructions. To her safety wasn't just a list of rules. It was a culture, a mindset that had to permeate every level of an airline's operation, from the engineers who designed the plane to the flight attendants who were the first line of defense in an emergency. The Boeing 737 MAX 9, powered by its two massive LEAP 1B engines, taxied onto the runway. Althea felt the familiar rumble as the engines spooled up a controlled explosion of power that she understood down to the molecular level. The roar grew, and the plane surged forward, pressing her gently into her seat. The ground fell away, and Atlanta became a sprawling map below. As the plane climbed through 10,000 feet, the double chime echoed through the cabin, signaling that the flight attendants could begin their duties. Althea's throat was now genuinely parched. She saw Susan and another flight attendant, a younger man named Mark, emerge from the forward galley with their cart. They started at the front of the Comfort Plus cabin. "Anything to drink, sir?" Susan asked the man in 11A, her voice a syrupy, sweet melody that was jarringly different from the tone she had used with Althea. She poured him an orange juice, offered him a packet of Biscoff cookies, and shared a brief, warm laugh. She served the couple in row 11C and 11D with the same practiced charm. When the cart reached row 12, Susan deliberately angled her body towards the two passengers on the other side of the aisle, a white couple in their 60s. "And for you too, coffee, a soft drink." Althea waited patiently. After Susan had served them, she turned her attention to the man sitting next to Althea in the window seat 12A. He asked for a ginger ale. Susan poured it for him, her arm reaching directly across Althea's personal space without a word of acknowledgement, as if Althea were an invisible obstruction. Finally, the cart was directly in front of her. Susan looked at her, the mask of professional courtesy completely gone, replaced by a flat, dismissive stare. "And you?" Susan asked. The two words hung in the air, stripped of any politeness. "I'd just like a bottle of water, please," Althea repeated, her voice still even. Susan's lips tightened. She glanced at her cart. There were several small plastic bottles of Aura water, clearly visible. She reached instead for a plastic cup. "Ice." "A bottle would be preferable if you don't mind," Althea said. It was a small thing, but for a 5-hour flight, a bottle was more practical. Susan let out an audible, exasperated sigh. "We're supposed to save the bottles for the full flight service. I can give you a cup." It was a blatant lie. The man in 11A had received a can of orange juice. The woman across the aisle had a full can of Diet Coke. The policy was clearly not to ration sealed beverages. This was personal. "A cup is fine, then," Althea conceded, not wanting to create a scene. The principle of the matter stung, but her thirst was a more immediate concern. Susan grabbed a cup scooped in a miserly 3 ice cubes and filled it less than halfway from a large open jug of water. She placed it on Althea's tray table with a clatter, a few drops sloshing onto the surface. She then immediately turned to her colleague Mark and said loud enough for the entire row to hear, "Make sure you check the manifest. Some people get upgraded to Comfort Plus, but still expect first-class service." The insult was as sharp and cold as the ice in her cup. The man in 12A shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The woman in 13C, who had overheard the exchange, gave Althea a look of sympathetic disbelief. Humiliation washed over Althea, hot and swift. It was demeaning, unprofessional, and so utterly unnecessary. She was a professional woman, a leader in her field, being treated like a freeloader by a person whose primary job was passenger safety and comfort. She took a small sip of the water, the meager amount, barely enough to wet her lips. She thought about pressing the call button. She thought about taking Susan's name and filing a formal complaint upon landing. But as she sat there, a different part of her brain, the auditor, the engineer, began to take over. This wasn't just rude. It was a deviation from protocol. A flight attendant displaying such open hostility and poor judgment was not someone who could be trusted in a crisis. What if there were a real emergency? Would her personal biases affect her ability to perform her duties? Would she listen to a passenger in distress if that passenger looked like her? The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. It was in that moment of cold clarity, as she stared at the few drops of water on her tray table, that Althea's attention was drawn to something else. A sound. A tiny, almost imperceptible noise that was out of place in the symphony of flight. It was a faint, high-pitched whistle, and it was coming from the window next to her seatmate. Initially, Althea dismissed the sound. The modern aircraft cabin is a cacophony of normalized noises, the omnipresent roar of the engines, the rush of circulated air through vents, the creaks and groans of a pressurized tube flexing at 35,000 feet. She was attuned to these sounds, could probably have identified a specific model of aircraft, blindfolded, just by the unique frequency of its environmental control system. But this was different. It wasn't constant. It was an intermittent, razor-thin whistle, like air being forced through a tiny crack. It would last for 2 or 3 seconds, fade, and then return a minute later. It was precisely the kind of sound that 99.9% of passengers would never notice or would dismiss as just another quirk of the plane. Althea was the 0.1%. She leaned slightly towards the window, trying to isolate the source. The man in 12A, a young software developer named Ben, noticed her movement. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Do you hear that?" Althea asked quietly, not wanting to cause alarm. A faint whistling sound. Ben paused, his movie pulled off his headphones, and listened intently. After a moment, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I do actually. Now that you mention it. Weird. Is that normal?" "It shouldn't be," Althea said, her mind racing through diagnostic flowcharts. A high-pitched whistle from the fuselage wall could be benign an issue with cabin trim insulation, perhaps. Or it could be a sign of something far more serious, a minute leak in a window seal or a door plug. At this altitude, the pressure differential between the inside and outside of the aircraft was immense, around 8 pounds per square inch. A small leak could, under the right stress conditions, become a big leak. A big leak at 35,000 feet could lead to a slow, insidious decompression, or in a worst-case scenario, a catastrophic failure. Her training kicked in, pushing the personal insult from Susan Miller to the back of her mind, replaced by a much more urgent and primal concern: safety. The culture of aviation safety was built on a simple, unbreakable rule: report everything. No concern is too small. No observation is insignificant. She needed to inform the cabin crew immediately. Protocol dictated that they would then inform the flight deck, and the pilots would monitor the cabin pressurization systems and make a determination. With a deep breath, Althea pressed the flight attendant call button above her head. The light illuminated with a soft blue glow. She waited. A minute passed, then 2. Flight attendants walked past her aisle, attending to other passengers, but her light remained on unanswered. She saw Susan at the front of the cabin, laughing with another crew member, deliberately ignoring the call light from row 12. The disregard was so blatant, so unprofessional, it bordered on malicious. Althea felt a surge of anger, but she suppressed it. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed to be calm, logical, and firm. She pressed the call button again. This time, after another 30 seconds, the younger flight attendant, Mark, approached. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite and professional. "Yes, thank you," Althea said, keeping her voice low but firm to avoid alarming nearby passengers. "I need you to inform the captain that there is an intermittent high-pitched whistling sound emanating from the seal of the window at seat 12A. I am concerned it could be an indicator of a potential pressurization leak." Mark's eyes widened slightly. This was not a request for a pillow or a drink. He leaned in, listened, and his face paled. He heard it too. "Okay, right away. I'll let the purser know." He hurried to the front of the plane. Althea watched as he spoke to the purser, who then turned and spoke to Susan Miller. Althea saw Susan's expression curdle. She shook her head dismissively, her body language radiating disbelief and annoyance. She gestured towards Althea with a flick of her hand, as if swatting away a fly. Then, instead of going to the cockpit interphone, Susan marched down the aisle, her shoes clicking with angry purpose. She stopped at row 12, planting her hands on her hips. "We've turned off your call light," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The plane makes noises. It's perfectly normal. Please don't create unnecessary panic among the other passengers with these fantasies." The word fantasies hung in the air, a deliberate, calculated insult designed to paint Althea as a hysterical, attention-seeking woman. This was the moment the situation crossed a critical threshold. Susan Miller had not only failed at customer service, she had now actively obstructed a potential safety report. She had dismissed a credible concern from a passenger without investigation, and had chosen to frame it as a behavioral issue. She was not just a rude flight attendant. She was a clear and present danger to everyone on the aircraft. Althea looked directly into Susan's hostile eyes. The warmth was gone from her own. Her expression was now one of cold, hard steel. "My name is Dr. Althea Hayes," she said, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that commanded attention. "I am the Senior Safety and Propulsion Systems Auditor for Stellara Aerospace, the company that built this aircraft. I am formally invoking my authority under FAA Part 121 regulations concerning airworthiness and crew interference. You have failed to follow standard safety protocol. Now, I am not asking you, I am instructing you to get me the captain, immediately, or I will have your license and this airline's certificate of operation suspended for review before this plane touches the ground." The silence that followed was absolute. Ben in seat 12A stared, his jaw slack. The passengers in the surrounding rows who had been trying to mind their own business were now frozen, listening to every word. Susan Miller's face went from smugly contemptuous to ashen white. The name Stellara Aerospace and the authoritative tone in Althea's voice had finally broken through her wall of prejudice and personal misery. She had not been dealing with an ordinary passenger. She had been blocking a safety report from one of the highest authorities on this very aircraft. The magnitude of her error, of her catastrophic misjudgment, crashed down on her all at once. She stood there speechless as the faint, high-pitched whistle sounded again from the window, a tiny siren heralding her doom. For a few eternal seconds, Susan Miller remained frozen, her mind struggling to process the cataclysmic shift that had just occurred. The power dynamic in the aisle of Flight 1781 had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. The woman she had dismissed, insulted, and denied a basic courtesy was now holding the fate of her career and the flight itself in her hands. Althea did not blink. She held Susan's terrified gaze, her expression unyielding. "The captain?" She repeated, her voice cutting through the silence. "Now." Susan stumbled backward, turned, and practically fled to the front of the aircraft. This time there was no hesitation. She went straight to the reinforced cockpit door and spoke urgently into the interphone. A few moments later, the purser, a man in his late 40s named Robert, approached Althea's seat. His face was a controlled mask of concern. "Dr. Hayes, I'm Robert, the purser on this flight. Captain Evans would like to speak with you. Would you be willing to come to the forward galley?" "Of course," Althea said. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements deliberate and poised. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of every passenger on her. The whispers had already started a ripple of speculation and unease spreading through the cabin. In the small galley area, Captain David Evans was waiting. He was a tall man with silvering hair and a calm demeanor that came from thousands of hours of command. He had already been briefed by a stammering, terrified Susan Miller. "Dr. Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Captain Evans. I am so sorry for the lapse in service you've experienced. My purser informs me you have a safety concern." Althea shook his hand firmly. "Captain, the lapse in service is a symptom of a much larger problem. I observed an intermittent high-pitched sound consistent with a potential pressure seal leak at window 12A. When I attempted to report this through the proper channels, your lead cabin attendant, Ms. Miller, not only ignored my call light, but when finally confronted, dismissed my concern as a fantasy and accused me of attempting to cause a panic. She actively refused to relay a safety report to the flight deck." Captain Evans's calm facade tightened. Obstructing a safety report was one of the gravest sins a crew member could commit. "I see," he said, his voice low and serious. "The first officer is currently checking the cabin pressure differential readings. So far they are stable, but that doesn't mean a small leak isn't present. A stable reading can be deceptive in the early stages of a seal failure, Captain. You know that Althea stated not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact between two professionals. It can hold steady until a specific stress point or altitude change causes it to worsen exponentially. The core issue here, however, is not just the potential leak, it's the breakdown in crew resource management. Your flight attendant's behavior demonstrates a critical failure in judgment. Her personal biases prevented her from performing the most fundamental part of her job, ensuring passenger safety. If she is willing to ignore a potential airframe integrity issue because she doesn't like the look of a passenger, What other duties is she failing to perform? Are the emergency oxygen masks properly primed? Is the fire suppression equipment in the cargo hold properly armed? Her credibility as a safety professional on this flight is zero. Every word landed like a hammer blow. Captain Evans knew she was right. The trust in his crew was broken. The chain of command had been compromised by Susan's behavior. "What do you recommend, Doctor?" He asked the question, laced with the heavy weight of command responsibility. Althea looked him directly in the eye. "I am officially declaring my lack of confidence in the fitness of this cabin crew to handle a potential emergency. Furthermore, given the unverified but credible threat to the aircraft's pressure hull, I cannot in good conscience allow this flight to continue to its destination. I am recommending an immediate diversion and a full safety inspection on the ground. However, given our proximity to Atlanta and the severity of the crew failure, the most prudent course of action is to return to the gate. I am formally grounding this aircraft." The words, "grounding this aircraft," sucked the air out of the galley. It was a phrase with immense power and catastrophic financial and logistical implications. But Althea Hayes was one of the few people on the planet who could say it with absolute authority. As a senior auditor for the manufacturer, her directive carried the same weight as an FAA emergency order. To ignore it would be to willfully fly a potentially unsafe aircraft with a compromised crew, a career-ending and possibly life-ending decision for any pilot. Captain Evans nodded slowly, his face grim. He had no choice. He trusted the engineer who helped design the plane over a flight attendant who had so clearly lost her composure. "Understood, Doctor." "Hayes," he said. He turned and spoke into the interphone to his first officer. "Michael, advise ATL Center. We have a potential airframe integrity issue and a crew management failure. We are declaring a pan-pan and returning to Hartsfield-Jackson. Turn us around." A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the PA system. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen technical issue with the aircraft that requires an immediate inspection, and out of an abundance of caution for your safety, we will be returning to our gate in Atlanta. We apologize for the inconvenience this will cause to your travel plans. The cabin crew will provide you with more information once we are on the ground." A collective groan swept through the cabin. Confusion and anger began to bubble. But for Althea back in her seat, there was only a sense of grim, resolute duty. She had not wanted this. She had simply wanted a bottle of water. But she had been given a test of her patience, of her professionalism, and ultimately of her commitment to the safety of every single soul on board. And she had not failed. The plane began a long, gentle turn back towards the east. Below, the clouds drifted by, oblivious to the human drama unfolding in the metal tube soaring above them. Susan Miller was nowhere to be seen. She had retreated to the rear galley, hidden from the 200 pairs of eyes that were now, thanks to the cabin rumor mill, all focused on the calm, dignified black woman in seat 12C. The return to Hartsfield-Jackson was tense and surreal. The descent was faster than usual, an expedited arrival for a flight declaring a pan-pan. Passengers peppered the remaining flight attendants with questions, their initial disappointment curdling into genuine concern. Was it the engine, the wings? Was there a bomb threat? The crew, under strict orders from the captain, gave only vague, rehearsed answers about a minor technical precaution, which only served to fuel the speculation. Althea remained quiet in her seat, observing. She saw the fear in some passengers' eyes and felt a pang of regret for the disruption she had caused, but it was overshadowed by the certainty of her decision. Safety was a non-negotiable absolute. When the plane landed, it didn't taxi to its original gate. Instead, it was met on a remote stand by a phalanx of vehicles, airport operations trucks, Aura Airlines ground support, and most tellingly, 2 black sedans. The jet bridge couldn't reach them here. They would be deplaning via airstairs. As soon as the engine spooled down and the seatbelt sign was extinguished, a new voice came over the PA, this one belonging to a man on the ground who had boarded the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Carmichael, and I am the Chief of Station for Aura Airlines here in Atlanta. Please remain in your seats. We are bringing stairs to the doors and will deplane you by rows. We understand this is a major disruption, and our gate agents inside the terminal will be handling rebooking for every one of you. We sincerely apologize." The deplaning process was orderly, but charged with an undercurrent of anger and confusion. As passengers filed off, many of them glanced at Althea, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility, blaming her for the cancellation. She ignored them, her focus entirely on the next steps. When her row was called, she descended the airstairs into the humid Georgia air. John Carmichael was waiting for her at the bottom. He was a man in his 50s with a harried look, his tie loosened. With him was another executive. "Dr. Hayes," Carmichael said, his tone one of deep reverence and anxiety. "I'm John Carmichael. This is David Thompson, our Vice President of Operations, who happened to be in the terminal. We cannot apologize enough for what happened on this flight. We have a car ready for you." Before Althea could respond, another scene unfolded nearby. Susan Miller was the last of the crew to deplane. She was met not by airline executives, but by 2 members of airport security, and a stern-faced woman in a corporate suit who Althea recognized as an in-house union representative. Susan's face was blotchy and tear-streaked. Her 30-year career was evaporating before her eyes on the hot tarmac. "This is ridiculous, she's lying." Susan's voice was shrill, cracking with desperation as she saw Althea with the executives. "I was just following procedure. She was being disruptive." Carmichael turned to one of the security officers. "Please escort Ms. Miller to the Crew Operations Center. She is officially suspended, pending a full investigation. Take her credentials." The finality of the order seemed to break something in Susan. She looked at Althea with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You did this!" she shrieked. "You think you're so important, you just wanted to cause trouble." Althea met her gaze, her heart filled not with triumph, but with a profound sadness. "No, Susan," she said, her voice carrying across the tarmac. "You did this to yourself. All I wanted was a glass of water." The security guards, gently but firmly, led a sobbing Susan Miller away. The other crew members from Flight 1781 were huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, waiting to be taken for their own debriefings. Their fate was now tied to Susan's, their careers in jeopardy, for having been part of a crew that had so spectacularly failed. Althea was ushered into one of the black sedans. Inside David Thompson, the VP of Operations turned to her, his face grim. "Dr. Hayes, on behalf of Aura Airlines, I offer our deepest and most sincere apologies. The behavior you endured is unacceptable and antithetical to everything our airline stands for. We will be launching a full top-to-bottom investigation. Your report on the crew's conduct will be central to it." "My report will be thorough," Althea promised. "But my more immediate concern is the aircraft. I need your assurance that a team from Stellara Aerospace, led by me, will have unrestricted access to that plane immediately. We need to inspect the window seal at 12A and the corresponding door plug. We need to pull the flight data recorder and analyze the cabin pressure logs minute by minute." "Of course, Doctor. Anything you need," Thompson said quickly. "A full maintenance team is on standby. Your team has carte blanche." As the sedan drove towards a private section of the terminal, Althea looked back at the grounded Boeing 737 MAX 9. It sat alone on the vast expanse of concrete, a magnificent machine rendered inert by a single ugly act of human failure. The story was far from over. The professional fallout for Susan and Aura Airlines was just beginning, and the investigation into the little whistle in the wind was about to uncover a secret far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The investigation proceeded with the speed and intensity of a major incident response. While Aura Airlines' HR department dealt with the human fallout, Althea Hayes led a joint team of Stellara Aerospace and Aura maintenance engineers into the cabin of the grounded aircraft. The atmosphere was clinical and tense. Under the glare of portable floodlights, they meticulously examined the window at seat 12A. To the naked eye, everything appeared normal. But when they used a high-pressure differential tester, a device that could simulate the pressure conditions of high-altitude flight on the ground, the truth revealed itself. A faint, almost invisible hiss emanated from the top of the window seal. A thermal imaging camera confirmed it. A tiny stream of cooler outside air was being forced through a microscopic flaw in the gasket. "It's a manufacturing defect," one of Althea's lead engineers, a man named George, muttered, his face ashen. "The seal wasn't seated properly during assembly. The adhesive is failing." The implications were chilling. This wasn't damage sustained during flight. This plane had rolled off the assembly line with this flaw. Althea's mind went into overdrive. "Pull the manufacturing logs for this specific airframe. I want to know the date, the shift, and the specific technician who installed this window assembly. Then cross-reference it. I want a list of every single 737 MAX 9 fuselage that was assembled on that line by that same team within a 60-day window." The search sent shockwaves through Stellara Aerospace's headquarters in Seattle. As the data came in, a horrifying pattern emerged. The team responsible for a batch of 118 aircraft had been using a new fast-curing sealant that had not been properly vetted. Under the constant stress cycles of pressurization and depressurization, the sealant was prone to microfracturing. Within 48 hours, Althea's initial report had escalated into a full-blown safety crisis. Regulators at the FAA and the NTSB were brought in. Emergency inspections were ordered on 2 other Aura Airlines, 737 MAX 9s from the same manufacturing batch. They found the exact same flaw. Dr. Althea Hayes hadn't just identified a single faulty window seal on a single aircraft. Her refusal to be dismissed, her insistence on protocol, had uncovered a systemic fleet-wide manufacturing defect that could have at any moment resulted in a slow decompression, or worse, an explosive failure of a window or door plug at cruising altitude. The little whistle Susan Miller had called a fantasy was the harbinger of a potential catastrophe. Meanwhile, the internal investigation at Aura Airlines into Susan Miller concluded with brutal efficiency. Multiple passengers, including Ben from seat 12A and the woman from 13C, submitted written statements corroborating Althea's account of the events. They described Susan's dismissive tone, her refusal of the water bottle, and the loud, demeaning comment she had made. They detailed her complete dismissal of Althea's safety concern. Susan Miller's work history was exhumed. It was littered with minor complaints over the years, a pattern of curtness and unprofessional attitude, particularly directed towards non-white passengers. The complaints had always been just minor enough to be dismissed with a slap on the wrist or a note in her file. But now, seen through the lens of the Flight 1781 incident, they formed a clear and damning picture of escalating prejudice and dereliction of duty. Susan Miller was terminated for gross misconduct, endangerment of passengers, and failure to comply with federal aviation safety regulations. Her flight attendant license was revoked by the FAA, ensuring she would never work on a commercial aircraft again. The purser Robert was demoted for his failure to adequately supervise his crew, and Mark, the junior attendant, was sent for retraining. Aura Airlines fired the entire crew of Flight 1781 as a stark message to its workforce. There was zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. The story inevitably leaked to the press. It became a viral sensation. News outlets framed it with sensational headlines: "Hero Engineer Grounds, Flight After Flight, Attendant's Racist Rant, and the Glass of Water that Saved Hundreds of Lives." Dr. Althea Hayes was lauded as a hero. She was praised for her calm professionalism, her unwavering commitment to safety, and her courage in the face of blatant discrimination. Stellara Aerospace, while facing a public relations nightmare and the immense cost of recalling and repairing 118 aircraft, publicly credited her with preventing a potential disaster. She was promoted to Vice President of Global Safety Oversight. For Althea, the adulation was uncomfortable. She had not sought to be a hero. She had simply done her job first as a passenger, expecting basic decency, and then as an engineer, upholding her oath. The real story for her was not about heroism, but about the insidious nature of prejudice. It showed how a small act of bias, a simple refusal to see another person's humanity, could have a domino effect with potentially lethal consequences. 2 years passed. The world of aviation moved on as it always does. The Stellara sealant defect, as it came to be known, was rectified. New, more stringent assembly protocols were put in place. The incident became a case study at aviation academies, a textbook example of the importance of crew resource management and the dangers of human factor failures. Dr. Althea Hayes became one of the most respected voices in the industry. She spearheaded a new initiative mandated by the FAA and adopted by airlines worldwide called the Culture of Active Safety. It retrained cabin crews to not only follow procedures, but to actively listen to and validate passenger concerns, no matter how small they seemed. The program emphasized that every person on the plane crew and passenger alike was a potential safety asset. It was unofficially but widely known throughout the industry as the Hayes Mandate. One autumn afternoon in a dreary coffee shop in a forgotten suburb outside of Dayton, Ohio, a woman sat huddled over a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her hair was unkempt, her face etched with lines of bitterness and regret. She wore a faded polo shirt from her job as a stocker at a big box retail store, a job she hated, a job that paid a fraction of what she used to make. It was Susan Miller. Her life had completely unraveled. After being fired, she became a pariah. Her name was synonymous with disgrace in the aviation community. No other airline would even grant her an interview. Her friends from her flying days stopped calling. The public shaming online had been relentless, turning her into a Karen meme, a caricature of racist entitlement. Her son, embarrassed and angry, rarely spoke to her. She had lost her house to foreclosure 6 months ago and was now living in a small, run-down apartment. She had spent months telling herself she was the victim, that Dr. Hayes had been an arrogant troublemaker who had deliberately ruined her life. But in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, the truth was an unavoidable tormentor. She replayed the scene in her mind 1,000 times, the polite smile on Althea's face, the simple, reasonable request, her own inexplicable venomous reaction. It had been about her bad day, her resentment, her jealousy, but she had chosen to aim all that poison at a black woman who, in her twisted mind, didn't belong in that premium seat. On this particular afternoon, she was scrolling through a news app on her cheap smartphone when a headline caught her eye. Dr. Althea Hayes addresses Global Aviation Summit, praises success of the Hayes Mandate. Susan clicked on the article. It featured a picture of Althea at a podium looking poised, powerful, and respected. The article detailed how the safety program Althea had championed had already been credited with preventing at least 2 potential incidents by empowering passengers and crew to report minor anomalies that turned out to be serious. She read Althea's quote, "Safety is not just mechanical, it's cultural. It begins with respecting the dignity and humanity of every single person on board. When we fail at that basic level, the entire system is at risk. We must never forget that the smallest act of ignorance can have the largest consequences." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, hot and bitter. This was her legacy. She wasn't just the flight attendant who got fired. She was the reason this global mandate existed. Her name would never be on it, but her failure was its foundation. Her act of petty racism had inadvertently made air travel safer for millions of people. Dr. Hayes had become a hero, saving lives and changing an industry. And she, Susan Miller, was the villain of the story, the cautionary tale whispered in training rooms, the ghost of what happens when you let hatred cloud your judgment. That was the hardest karma of all. It wasn't just the loss of her job, her home, or her reputation. It was the crushing, inescapable knowledge that her worst moment had, through the grace and professionalism of the very woman she had wronged, been transformed into a force for good in the world. A good she could never be a part of. She was grounded forever by the weight of her own prejudice, while Dr. Althea Hayes continued to soar. 3 more years went by, turning the Flight 1781 incident from a headline into an industry legend. Dr. Althea Hayes was in Chicago, delivering the keynote address at the annual Global Aviation Safety Symposium. Her speech on the human element in system integrity was met with a thunderous standing ovation. She was at the pinnacle of her career, a respected and transformative figure whose work had tangibly saved lives. After the conference, instead of taking a car to O'Hare, she opted for the airport transit train, enjoying the rare moment of anonymity among the bustling crowds. As she stood holding a pole, gazing absently at the passing city lights, a woman boarded at the Rosemont stop. She was older, her hair now completely grey, and she wore the simple, practical uniform of a transit authority janitor. She pushed a large yellow cart laden with cleaning supplies, her movements weary but efficient. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Recognition dawned on Althea's face. First a flicker of surprise, she quickly masked. The woman froze the spray bottle in her hand, clattering against the metal frame of her cart. It was Susan Miller. The years had not been kind, but the harshness in her features had been replaced by something else, a deep, profound exhaustion that seemed to emanate from her soul. The bitter anger Althea remembered from the tarmac was gone, scoured away, leaving a quiet, hollowed-out resignation. Susan looked as if she wanted to vanish. She quickly looked down her face, flushing with a shame so palpable it felt like a physical presence in the train car. She began to push her cart towards the other end, desperate to escape. But Althea stepped forward. "Susan," she said, her voice soft, not accusatory. Susan stopped, her back still to Althea. Her shoulders hunched as she braced for the inevitable confrontation, the deserved rebuke she had been running from for 5 years. "I read about what you've been doing," Susan said, her voice raspy, barely a whisper. She didn't turn around. "The Hayes mandate. My son, he's in flight school now. They study you. They study what I did. He told me it's the first thing they learn in their human factors class." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of consequence and irony. Althea was momentarily speechless. The idea of Susan's son learning from his own mother's failure was a turn of fate she could never have imagined. It was a form of karma more complex and intimate than public shame or financial ruin. I hope he becomes an excellent pilot, Althea said finally, her tone sincere. Susan slowly turned to face her. Tears welled in her eyes, not of self-pity, but of something closer to release. He will, she said. He knows the cost of not listening. I made sure of that. She took a ragged breath. For what it's worth. Dr. Hayes, I know it's 5 years too late, but I am truly, deeply sorry. Not for my job, not for my house, but for what I did to you. The way I treated you. There's no excuse. I was an ugly person. And I'm sorry. In that moment, Althea saw not the monster from her memory, but a broken woman who had been forced to confront the wreckage of her own prejudice, and had, through a long and painful process, found a sliver of accountability. The anger Althea had long since processed was replaced by a surprising wave of empathy. Thank you, Susan, Althea said, her voice gentle. I appreciate that. I hope you find peace. Susan nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her worn work glove. She gave a small, sad smile. Peace is a long way off, but I'm cleaning up my own messes now. It's a start. She pushed her cart away as the train pulled into the O'Hare station. Althea watched her go, a solitary figure in a janitor's uniform, disappearing into the anonymous river of travellers. The encounter had been a final, unscheduled arrival, a closing of a chapter she didn't even realize was still open. As Althea stepped off the train and walked towards her gate, she felt the last bit of turbulence from Flight 1781 finally smooth out, leaving behind only a calm, quiet clarity. The system was safer, a lesson had been learned, and even the person who caused the storm had finally begun the long, hard work of clearing the wreckage. 8 years after the incident that redefined aviation safety culture, First Officer Alex Miller sat in the right-hand seat of an Aura Airlines 737. He flew with a quiet diligence that went beyond training. It was a personal creed. The ghost of his mother, Susan's mistake, was his compass, guiding him toward a vigilance he knew was non-negotiable. Midway through a routine flight to Seattle, a call came from the cabin. A passenger in row 24 reported a faint, intermittent vibration in the floor. It was the kind of vague report pilots hear, often almost always benign. The temptation to simply reassure and move on was strong, but Alex froze. Faint, intermittent, easy to ignore. The words echoed the story that had shaped his entire life, the story of a faint whistle that was nearly dismissed. He saw the face of Dr. Althea Hayes, a woman he'd never met, but whose principles he lived by. Captain, he said, his voice firm. The Hayes mandate requires we treat every passenger report as credible data. I'd like to coordinate with the cabin crew and request a full ground inspection of the corresponding landing gear assembly upon arrival. His captain, respecting his conviction, agreed. Alex calmly worked with the crew, treating the passengers' concern with the utmost seriousness. They landed in Seattle without issue, but as the passengers deplaned, a maintenance team was already swarming the aircraft. An hour later, the chief engineer called the cockpit, his voice charged with awe. First Officer Miller, you're not going to believe this. We found a hairline fracture in a hydraulic line to the landing gear. It wouldn't have failed today, but it was a ticking time bomb. You just prevented a disaster. That evening, from his hotel room overlooking the city, Alex called his mother. Susan's life was quiet now, spent working in a community garden far from the roar of jets. He recounted the day's events, from the passenger's vague feeling to the engineer's critical discovery. He finished by saying the words he knew she needed to hear. It was your lesson, Mum. It's what you taught me the hard way. It made me listen. It made me a better pilot today. A choked sob came through the phone. It wasn't the sound of grief, but of a profound, painful pride. Her legacy was no longer one of shame on a tarmac. It was alive in the cockpit, in her son's integrity. The final redemptive karma was not her punishment, but the quiet heroism she had inspired in him. The lesson was complete. This incredible story serves as a powerful and chilling reminder of how a single act of prejudice, born from a moment of personal bitterness, can spiral into a situation with life or death consequences. Susan Miller's refusal to serve a glass of water wasn't just poor service. It was a symptom of a deeper failure to see the humanity in a passenger, a failure that nearly masked a catastrophic technical defect. In contrast, Dr. Althea Hayes showed us the immense power of quiet dignity, professionalism, and an unwavering commitment to what is right. She didn't just stand up for herself. She stood up for the safety of every person on that flight, and ultimately countless others. If this story shocked you or made you think, please hit that like button to help us share it with more people. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Dr. Hayes' position? Share this video with your friends and family to spread this important message. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell for more incredible true-life dramas that you won't want to miss. Thank you for listening.